Chapter 13. Of Auxiliary, Mixed, and Native Troops. When one asks a powerful neighbor to come to aid and defend one with his forces, they are termed auxiliaries, and are as useless as mercenaries. This was done in recent times by Julius, who, seeing the wretched failure of his mercenary forces in his Ferrara enterprise, had recourse to auxiliaries, and arranged with Ferrando, king of Spain, that he should help him with his armies. These forces may be good in themselves, but they're always dangerous for those who borrow them. For if they lose, you are defeated, and if they conquer, you remain their prisoner. And although ancient history is full of examples of this, I won't depart from the example of Pope Julius II, which is still fresh. Nothing could be less prudent than the course he adopted. For, wishing to take Ferrara, he put himself entirely into the power of a foreigner. But by good fortune there arose a third cause which prevented him reaping the effects of his bad policy. For when his auxiliaries were beaten at Ravenna, the Swiss rose up and drove back the victors, against all expectation of himself or others, so that he wasn't taken prisoner by the enemy which had fled, nor by his own auxiliaries, having conquered by other arms than theirs. The Florentines, being totally disarmed, hired 10,000 Frenchmen to attack Pisa, by which measure they ran greater risk than at any period of their struggles. The Emperor of Constantinople, to oppose his neighbors, put 10,000 Turks into Greece, who after the war wouldn't go away again, which was the beginning of the servitude of Greece to the infidels. And one therefore who wishes not to conquer would do well to use these forces, which are much more dangerous than mercenaries. As with them ruin is complete, for they are all united, and owe obedience to others, whereas with mercenaries, when they have conquered, it requires more time and a good opportunity for them to injure you, as they don't form a single body, and have been engaged and paid by you. Therefore, a third party that you have made leader can't at once acquire enough authority to be able to injure you. In a word, the greatest danger with mercenaries lies in their cowardice and reluctance to fight. But with auxiliaries, the danger lies in their courage. A wise prince, therefore, always avoids these forces and has recourse to his own, and would prefer rather to lose with his own men than conquer with the forces of others, not deeming it a true victory which is gained by foreign arms. I never hesitate to cite the example of Cesare Borgia and his actions. This duke entered Romagna with auxiliary troops, leading forces composed entirely of French soldiers, and with these he took Imola and Forlì. But as they seemed unsafe, he had recourse to mercenaries as a less risky policy, and hired the Orsini and Vitelli. Afterwards, finding these uncertain to handle, unfaithful and dangerous, he suppressed them, and relied upon his own men. And the difference between these forces can be easily seen if one considers the difference between the reputation of the Duke when he had only the French, when he had the Orsini and Vitelli, and when he had to rely on himself and his own soldiers. His reputation will be found to have constantly increased, and he was never so highly esteemed as when everyone saw that he was the sole master of his forces. I don't wish to depart from recent Italian instances, but I can't omit Hiero of Syracuse, whom I've already mentioned. This man, being, as I said, made head of the army by the Syracusans, immediately recognized the uselessness of that militia which was organized like our Italian mercenary troops, and as he thought it unsafe either to retain them or to dismiss them, he had them cut in pieces, and thenceforward made war with his own arms and not those of others. I would also call to mind a symbolic tale from the Old Testament which well illustrates this point. When David offered to Saul to go and fight against the Philistine champion Goliath, Saul, to encourage him, armed him with his own arms, which, when David had tried on, he refused, saying that with them he couldn't fight so well. He preferred, therefore, to face the enemy with his own sling and knife. In short, the arms of others either fail, overburden, or else impede you. Charles VII, father of King Louis XI, having through good fortune and bravery liberated France from the English, recognized this necessity of being armed with his own forces, and established in his kingdom a system of men-at-arms and infantry. Afterwards, King Louis, his son, abolished the infantry and began to hire Swiss, which mistake being followed by others is, as may now be seen, a cause of danger to that kingdom. For by giving such reputation to the Swiss, France has disheartened all her own troops, the infantry having been abolished and the men-at-arms being obliged to foreigners for assistance. For being accustomed to fight with Swiss troops, they think they cannot conquer without them. Whence it comes that the French are insufficiently strong to oppose the Swiss, and without the aid of the Swiss, they won't venture against others. The armies of the French are thus of a mixed kind, partly mercenary and partly her own. Taken together, they are much better than troops entirely composed of mercenaries or auxiliaries, but much inferior to national forces. And let this example be sufficient, for the kingdom of France would be invincible if Charles' military organization had been developed or maintained. But men with their lack of prudence initiate novelties, and finding the first taste good, don't notice the poison within, as I pointed out previously in regard to wasting fevers. The prince, therefore, who fails to recognize troubles in his state as they arise, is not truly wise, and it is given to few to be thus. If we consider the first cause of the collapse of the Roman Empire, we shall find it merely due to the hiring of Goth mercenaries, for from that time we find the Roman strength begins to weaken. All the advantages derived from the empire fell to the Goths. I conclude, then, by saying that no prince is secure without his own troops. On the contrary, he is entirely dependent on fortune, having no trustworthy means of defense in time of trouble. It has always been held and proclaimed by wise men, quod nihil sit tam infirmum, aut instabile quam fama potentii non sua vi nixi. One's own troops are those composed either of subjects or of citizens, or of one's own dependents. All others are mercenaries or auxiliaries. The way to organize one's own troops is easily learned if the methods of the 4 princes mentioned above be studied, and if one considers how Philip, father of Alexander the Great, and many republics and sovereigns have organized theirs. With such examples as these, there's no need to labor the point. Chapter 14. The duties of a prince with regard to the militia. A prince should therefore have no other aim or thought, nor take up any other thing for his study, but war, and its organization and discipline. For that is the only art that is necessary to one who commands, and it is of such virtue that it not only maintains those who are born princes, but often enables men of private fortune to attain to that rank. And one sees, on the other hand, that when princes think more of luxury than of arms, they lose their state. The chief cause of the loss of states is the contempt of this art, and the way to acquire them is to be well versed in the same. Francesco Sforza, through being well armed, became from private status Duke of Milan. His sons, through wishing to avoid the fatigue and hardships of war, from dukes became private persons. For among other evils caused by being disarmed, it renders you contemptible, which is one of those disgraceful things which a prince must guard against, as will be explained later. Because there's no comparison whatever between an armed and a disarmed man. It's not reasonable to suppose that one who is armed will obey willingly one who is unarmed, or that any unarmed man will remain safe among armed servants. For one being disdainful and the other suspicious, it's not possible for them to act well together. And therefore a prince who is ignorant of military matters, besides the other misfortunes already mentioned, can't be esteemed by his soldiers nor have confidence in them. He ought, therefore, never to let his thoughts stray from the exercise of war. And in peace he ought to practice it more than in war, which he can do in 2 ways, by action and by study. As to action, he must, besides keeping his men well disciplined and exercised, engage continually in hunting, and thus accustom his body to hardships. And meanwhile learn the nature of the land, how steep the mountains are, how the valleys debouch, where the plains lie, and understand the nature of rivers and swamps. To all this he should devote great attention. This knowledge is useful in two ways. In the first place, one learns to know one's country, and can the better see how to defend it. Then by means of the knowledge and experience gained in one locality, one can easily understand any other that it may be necessary to observe. For the hills and valleys, plains and rivers of Tuscany, for instance, have a certain resemblance to those of other provinces, so that from a knowledge of the country in one province, one can easily arrive at a knowledge of others. And that prince who is lacking in this skill is wanting in the first essentials of a leader. For it is this which teaches how to find the enemy, take up quarters, lead armies, plan battles, and lay siege to towns with advantage. Philopoemen, prince of the Achaea, among other praises bestowed on him by writers, is lauded because in times of peace he thought of nothing but the methods of warfare. And when he was in the country with his friends, he often stopped and asked them, "If the enemy were on that hill, and we found ourselves here with our army, which of us would have the advantage? How could we safely approach him maintaining our order? If we wish to retire, what ought we to do? If they retired, how should we follow them?" And he put before them as they went along all the contingencies that might happen to an army, heard their opinion, gave his own, fortifying it by argument, so that thanks to these constant reflections there could never happen any incident when actually leading his armies for which he wasn't prepared. But as to exercise for the mind, the prince ought to read history and study the actions of eminent men, see how they acted in warfare, examine the causes of their victories and defeats, in order to imitate the former and avoid the latter. And above all, do as some men have done in the past, who have imitated someone, who has been much praised and glorified, and have always kept his deeds and actions before them. As they say, Alexander the Great imitated Achilles, Caesar Alexander, and Scipio Cyrus. And whoever reads the life of Cyrus written by Xenophon will perceive in the life of Scipio how gloriously he imitated the former, and how in chastity, affability, humanity, and liberality Scipio conformed to those qualities of Cyrus as described by Xenophon. A wise prince should follow similar methods, and never remain idle in peaceful times, but industriously make good use of them, so that when fortune changes, she may find him prepared to resist her blows and to prevail in adversity. Chapter 15. Of the things for which men, and especially princes, are praised or blamed. It now remains to be seen what are the methods and rules for a prince as regards his subjects and friends. And as I know that many have written of this, I fear that my writing about it may be deemed presumptuous, differing as I do, especially in this matter, from the opinions of others. But my intention being to write something of use to those who understand, it appears to me more proper to go to the real truth of the matter than to its imagination. And many have imagined republics and principalities which have never been seen or known to exist in reality. For how we live is so far removed from how we ought to live, that he who abandons what is done for what ought to be done will rather learn to bring about his own ruin than his preservation. A man who wishes to make a profession of goodness in everything must necessarily come to grief among so many who are not good. Therefore it's necessary for a prince who wishes to maintain himself to learn how not to be good, and to use this knowledge and not use it according to the necessity of the case. Leaving on one side, then, those things which concern only an imaginary prince, and speaking of those that are real, I state that all men, and especially princes who are placed at a greater height, are reputed for certain qualities which bring them either praise or blame. Thus, one is considered liberal, another misero, or miserly, using a Tuscan term, seeing that avaro with us still means one who is rapaciously acquisitive, and misero one who makes grudging use of his own. One a free giver, another rapacious. One cruel, another merciful. One a breaker of his word, another trustworthy. One effeminate and pusillanimous, another fierce and high-spirited. One humane, another haughty. One lascivious, another chaste. One frank, another astute. One hard, another easy. One serious, another frivolous. One religious, another an unbeliever, and so on. I know that everyone will admit that it would be highly praiseworthy in a prince to possess all the above-named qualities that are reputed good. But as they can't all be possessed or observed, human conditions not permitting of it, it's necessary that he should be prudent enough to avoid the scandal of those vices which would lose him the state, and guard himself, if possible, against those which will not lose it him, but if not able to, he can indulge them with less scruple. And yet, he mustn't mind incurring the scandal of those vices, without which it would be difficult to save the state. For if one considers well, it will be found that some things which seem virtues would, if followed, lead to one's ruin, and some others which appear vices result in one's greater security and well-being. Chapter 16. Of Liberality and Niggardliness. Beginning now with the first qualities above named, I say that it would be well to be considered liberal. Nevertheless, liberality such as the world understands it will injure you, because if used virtuously and in the proper way, it won't be known, and you will incur the disgrace of the contrary vice. But one who wishes to obtain the reputation of liberality among men mustn't omit every kind of sumptuous display, and to such an extent that a prince of this character will consume by such means all his resources, and will be at last compelled, if he wishes to maintain his name for liberality, to impose heavy taxes on his people, become extortionate, and do everything possible to obtain money. This will make his subjects begin to hate him. And he will be little esteemed being poor, so that having by this liberality injured many and benefited but few, he will feel the first little disturbance and be endangered by every peril. If he recognizes this and wishes to change his system, he incurs at once the charge of niggardliness. A prince, therefore, not being able to exercise this virtue of liberality without risk if it be known, must not, if he be prudent, object to be called miserly. In course of time, he will be thought more liberal when it is seen that by his parsimony his revenue is sufficient, that he can defend himself against those who make war on him, and undertake enterprises without burdening his people, so that he's really liberal to all those from whom he does not take, who are infinite in number, and niggardly to all to whom he doesn't give, who are few. In our times, we have seen nothing great done except by those who have been esteemed niggardly. The others have all been ruined. Pope Julius II, although he had made use of a reputation for liberality in order to attain the papacy, didn't seek to retain it afterwards, so that he might be able to wage war. The present King of France has carried on so many wars without imposing an extraordinary tax, because his extra expenses were covered by the parsimony he had so long practiced. The present King of Spain, if he had been thought liberal, would not have engaged in and been successful in so many enterprises. For these reasons, a prince must care little for the reputation of being a miser, if he wishes to avoid robbing his subjects, if he wishes to be able to defend himself, to avoid becoming poor and contemptible, and not to be forced to become rapacious. This niggardliness is one of those vices which enable him to reign. If it's said that Caesar attained the empire through liberality, and that many others have reached the highest positions through being liberal or being thought so, I would reply that you are either a prince already or else on the way to become one. In the first case, this liberality is harmful. In the second, it's certainly necessary to be considered liberal. Caesar was one of those who wished to attain the mastery over Rome. But if after attaining it he had lived and hadn't moderated his expenses, he would have destroyed that empire. And should anyone reply that there have been many princes who have done great things with their armies, who have been thought extremely liberal, I would answer by saying that the prince may either spend his own wealth and that of his subjects, or the wealth of others. In the first case, he must be sparing, but for the rest, he must not neglect to be very liberal. The liberality is very necessary to a prince who marches with his armies, and lives by plunder, sack, and ransom, and is dealing with the wealth of others, for without it he wouldn't be followed by his soldiers. And you may be very generous indeed with what is not the property of yourself or your subjects, as were Cyrus, Caesar, and Alexander. For spending the wealth of others won't diminish your reputation but increase it. Only spending your own resources will injure you. There's nothing which destroys itself so much as liberality, for by using it, you lose the power of using it, and become either poor and despicable, or, to escape poverty, rapacious and hated. And of all things that a prince must guard against, the most important are being despicable or hated, and liberality will lead you to one or the other of these conditions. It's therefore wiser to have the name of a miser, which produces disgrace without hatred, than to incur of necessity the name of being rapacious, which produces both disgrace and hatred. Chapter 17. Of cruelty and clemency, and whether it is better to be loved or feared. Proceeding to the other qualities before named, I say that every prince must desire to be considered merciful and not cruel. He must, however, take care not to misuse this mercifulness. Cesare Borgia was considered cruel, but his cruelty had brought order to the Romagna, united it, and reduced it to peace and fealty. If this is considered well, it will be seen that he was really much more merciful than the Florentine people who, to avoid the name of cruelty, allowed Pistoia to be destroyed. A prince, therefore, mustn't mind incurring the charge of cruelty for the purpose of keeping his subjects united and faithful. For, with a very few examples, he will be more merciful than those who from excessive tenderness allow disorders to arise, from whence spring bloodshed and rapine. For these, as a rule, injure the whole community, while the executions carried out by the prince injure only individuals. And of all princes, it's impossible for a new prince to escape the reputation of cruelty, new states being always full of dangers. Wherefore Virgil, through the mouth of Dido, says, Res dura, et regni novitas me talia cogunt moliri, et late fines custode tueri. Nevertheless, he must be cautious in believing and acting, and mustn't be afraid of his own shadow, and must proceed in a temperate manner with prudence and humanity, so that too much confidence doesn't render him incautious, and too much diffidence doesn't render him intolerant. From this arises the question whether it is better to be loved more than feared, or feared more than loved. The reply is that one ought to be both feared and loved, but as it's difficult for the two to go together, it's much safer to be feared than loved if one of the two has to be wanting. For it may be said of men in general that they are ungrateful, voluble, dissemblers, anxious to avoid danger, and covetous of gain. As long as you benefit them, they're entirely yours. They offer you their blood, their goods, their life, and their children, as I've before said, when the necessity is remote. But when it approaches, they revolt. And the prince who has relied solely on their words without making other preparations is ruined. For the friendship which is gained by purchase, and not through grandeur and nobility of spirit, is bought but not secured, and at a pinch is not to be expended in your service. And men have less scruple in offending one who makes himself loved than one who makes himself feared. For love is held by a chain of obligation which, men being selfish, is broken whenever it serves their purpose. But fear is maintained by a dread of punishment which never fails. Still, a prince should make himself feared in such a way that if he doesn't gain love, he at any rate avoids hatred. For fear and the absence of hatred may go well together. and will always be attained by one who abstains from interfering with the property of his citizens and subjects, or with their women. And when he is obliged to take the life of anyone, let him do so when there is a proper justification and manifest reason for it. But above all, he must abstain from taking the property of others, for men forget more easily the death of their father than the loss of their patrimony. Then also pretexts for seizing property are never wanting, and one who begins to live by rapine will always find some reason for taking the goods of others, whereas causes for taking life are rarer and more fleeting. But when the prince is with his army, and has a large number of soldiers under his control, then it's extremely necessary that he shouldn't mind being thought cruel. For without this reputation, he couldn't keep an army united, or disposed to any duty. Among the noteworthy actions of Hannibal is numbered this, that although he had an enormous army composed of men of all nations and fighting in foreign countries, there never arose any dissension either among them or against the prince, either in good fortune or bad. This couldn't be due to anything but his inhuman cruelty, which, together with his infinite other virtues, made him always venerated and terrible in the sight of his soldiers. And without it his other virtues wouldn't have sufficed to produce that effect. Thoughtless writers admire on the one hand his actions, and on the other blame the principal cause of them. And that it is true that his other virtues wouldn't have sufficed may be seen from the case of Scipio, famous not only in regard to his own times, but all times of which memory remains, whose armies rebelled against him in Spain, which arose from nothing but his excessive kindness, which allowed more license to the soldiers than was consonant with military discipline. He was reproached with this in the Senate by Fabius Maximus, who called him a corrupter of the Roman militia. Locri, having been destroyed by one of Scipio's officers, wasn't revenged by him, nor was the insolence of that officer punished, simply by reason of his easy nature. So much so, that someone wishing to excuse him in the Senate said that there were many men who knew rather how not to err than how to correct the errors of others. This disposition would in time have tarnished the fame and glory of Scipio had he persevered in it under the empire. But living under the rule of the Senate, this harmful quality was not only concealed, but became a glory to him. I conclude, therefore, with regard to being feared and loved, that men love at their own free will, but fear at the will of the prince, and that a wise prince must rely on what is in his power, and not on what is in the power of others. And he must only contrive to avoid incurring hatred, as has been explained. Chapter 18. In what way princes must keep faith. How laudable it is for a prince to keep good faith and live with integrity, and not with astuteness, everyone knows. Still, the experience of our times shows those princes to have done great things who have had little regard for good faith, and have been able by astuteness to confuse men's brains, and who have ultimately overcome those who have made loyalty their foundation. You must know, then, that there are two methods of fighting, the one by law, the other by force. The first method is that of men, the second of beasts. But as the first method is often insufficient, one must have recourse to the second. It's therefore necessary for a prince to know well how to use both the beast and the man. This was covertly taught to rulers by ancient writers, who relate how Achilles and many others of those ancient princes were given to Chiron the centaur to be brought up and educated under his discipline. The parable of this semi-animal, semi-human teacher is meant to indicate that a prince must know how to use both natures, and that the one without the other is not durable. A prince, being thus obliged to know well how to act as a beast, must imitate the fox and the lion. For the lion can't protect himself from traps, and the fox can't defend himself from wolves. One must therefore be a fox to recognize traps, and a lion to frighten wolves. Those that wish to be only lions don't understand this. Therefore a prudent ruler ought not to keep faith when by so doing it would be against his interest, and when the reasons which made him bind himself no longer exist. If men were all good, this precept would not be a good one. But as they are bad, and wouldn't observe their faith with you, so you're not bound to keep faith with them. Nor have legitimate grounds ever failed a prince who wished to show colorable excuse for the non-fulfillment of his promise. Of this one could furnish an infinite number of modern examples, and show how many times peace has been broken and how many promises rendered worthless by the faithlessness of princes, and those that have been best able to imitate the fox have succeeded best. But it's necessary to be able to disguise this character well, and to be a great feigner and dissembler. And men are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities that one who deceives will always find those who allow themselves to be deceived. I will only mention one modern instance. Alexander VI did nothing else but deceive men. He thought of nothing else, and found the occasion for it. No man was ever more able to give assurances or affirmed things with stronger oaths, and no man observed them less. However, he always succeeded in his deceptions, as he well knew this aspect of things. It's not therefore necessary for a prince to have all the above-named qualities, but it's very necessary to seem to have them. I would even be bold to say that to possess them and always to observe them is dangerous, but to appear to possess them is useful. Thus it's well to seem merciful, faithful, humane, sincere, religious, and also to be so. But you must have the mind so disposed that when it's needful to be otherwise, you may be able to change to the opposite qualities. And it must be understood that a prince, and especially a new prince, can't observe all those things which are considered good in men, being often obliged, in order to maintain the state, to act against faith, against charity, against humanity, and against religion. And therefore, he must have a mind disposed to adapt itself according to the wind, and as the variations of fortune dictate, and as I said before, not deviate from what is good if possible, but be able to do evil if constrained. A prince must take great care that nothing goes out of his mouth which isn't full of the above-named 5 qualities. And, to see and hear him, he should seem to be all mercy, faith, integrity, humanity, and religion. And nothing is more necessary than to seem to have this last quality. For men in general judge more by the eyes than by the hands. For everyone can see, but very few have to feel. Everybody sees what you appear to be. Few feel what you are. And those few won't dare to oppose themselves to the many, who have the majesty of the state to defend them. And in the actions of men, and especially of princes, from which there is no appeal, the end justifies the means. Let a prince therefore aim at conquering and maintaining the state, and the means will always be judged honorable and praised by everyone. For the vulgar is always taken by appearances and the issue of the event, and the world consists only of the vulgar, and the few who are not vulgar are isolated when the many have a rallying point in the prince. A certain prince of the present time, whom it's well not to name, never does anything but preach peace and good faith, but he's really a great enemy to both, and either of them, had he observed them, would have lost him state or reputation on many occasions. Chapter 19. That we must avoid being despised and hated. But as I've now spoken of the most important of the qualities in question, I'll now deal briefly and generally with the rest. The prince must, as already stated, avoid those things which will make him hated or despised. And whenever he succeeds in this, he will have done his part, and will find no danger in other vices. He will chiefly become hated, as I said, by being rapacious, and usurping the property and women of his subjects, which he must abstain from doing. And whenever one doesn't attack the property or honor of the generality of men, they will live contented. And one will only have to combat the ambition of a few, who can be easily held in check in many ways. He's rendered despicable by being thought changeable, frivolous, effeminate, timid, and irresolute, which a prince must guard against as a rock of danger, and so contrive that his actions show grandeur, spirit, gravity, and fortitude. And as to the government of his subjects, let his sentence be irrevocable, and let him adhere to his decisions so that no one may think of deceiving or cozening him. The prince who creates such an opinion of himself gets a great reputation, and it's very difficult to conspire against one who has a great reputation, and he won't easily be attacked so long as it's known that he's capable and reverenced by his subjects. For a prince must have two kinds of fear, one internal as regards his subjects, one external as regards foreign powers. From the latter he can defend himself with good arms and good friends, and he'll always have good friends if he has good arms. And internal matters will always remain quiet if they're not perturbed by conspiracy, and there's no disturbance from without. And even if external powers sought to attack him, if he has ruled and lived as I've described, he will always, if he stands firm, be able to sustain every shock, as I've shown that Nabis the Spartan did. But with regard to the subjects, if not acted on from outside, it's still to be feared lest they conspire in secret, from which the prince may guard himself well by avoiding hatred and contempt, and keeping the people satisfied with him, which it is necessary to accomplish, as has been related at length. And one of the most potent remedies that a prince has against conspiracies is that of not being hated by the mass of the people. For whoever conspires always believes that he will satisfy the people by the death of their prince. But if he thought to offend them by doing this, he would fear to engage in such an undertaking, for the difficulties that conspirators have to meet are infinite. Experience shows that there have been very many conspiracies, but few have turned out well. For whoever conspires can't act alone, and can't find companions except among those who are discontented. And as soon as you have disclosed your intention to a malcontent, you give him the means of satisfying himself, for by revealing it, he can hope to secure everything he wants. To such an extent that seeing a certain gain by doing this, and seeing on the other hand only a doubtful one and full of danger, he must either be a rare friend to you, or else a very bitter enemy to the prince if he keeps faith with you. And to express the matter in a few words, I say that on the side of the conspirator there is nothing but fear, jealousy, suspicion, and dread of punishment which frightens him. And on the side of the prince there is the majesty of government, the laws, the protection of friends, and of the state, which guard him. When to these things is added the goodwill of the people, it's impossible that anyone should have the temerity to conspire. For whereas generally a conspirator has to fear before the execution of his plot, in this case, having the people for an enemy, he must also fear after his crime is accomplished, and thus he's not able to hope for any refuge. Numberless instances might be given of this, but I'll content myself with one which took place within the memory of our fathers. Messer Annibale Bentivogli, Prince of Bologna, ancestor of the present Messer Annibale, was killed by the Caneschi, who conspired against him. He left no relations but Messer Giovanni, who was then an infant, but after the murder the people rose up and killed all the Caneschi. This arose from the popular goodwill that the house of Bentivogli enjoyed at that time, which was so great that, as there was nobody left after the death of Annibale who could govern the state, the Bolognese, hearing that there was one of the Bentivogli family in Florence, who had till then been thought the son of a blacksmith, came to fetch him and gave him the government of the city, and it was governed by him until Messer Giovanni was old enough to assume the government. I conclude, therefore, that a prince need trouble little about conspiracies when the people are well disposed, but when they're hostile and hold him in hatred, then he must fear everything and everybody. Well-ordered states and wise princes have studied diligently not to drive the nobles to desperation, and to satisfy the populace and keep it contented, for this is one of the most important matters that a prince has to deal with. Among the kingdoms that are well-ordered and governed in our time is France, and there we find numberless good institutions on which depend the liberty and security of the king. Of these the chief is the Parliament and its authority, because he who established that kingdom, knowing the ambition and insolence of the great nobles, deemed it necessary to have a bit in their mouths to check them. And knowing on the other hand the hatred of the mass of the people against the great, based on fear, and wishing to secure them, he didn't wish to make this the special care of the king, to relieve him of the dissatisfaction that he might incur among the nobles by favoring the people, and among the people by favoring the nobles. He therefore established a third judge, that, without direct charge of the king, kept in check the great and favored the lesser people. Nor could any better or more prudent measure have been adopted, nor better precaution for the safety of the king and the kingdom. From which another notable rule can be drawn, that princes should let the carrying out of unpopular duties devolve on others, and bestow favors themselves. I conclude again by saying that a prince must esteem his nobles, but not make himself hated by the populace. It may perhaps seem to some that, considering the life and death of many Roman emperors, that they are instances contrary to my opinion, finding that some who always lived nobly and showed great strength of character nevertheless lost the empire, or were killed by their subjects who conspired against them. Wishing to answer these objections, I'll discuss the qualities of some emperors, showing the cause of their ruin not to be at variance with what I've stated. And I'll also meanwhile consider the things to be noted by whoever reads the deeds of these times. I'll content myself with taking all those emperors who succeeded to the empire, from Marcus the philosopher to Maximinus. These were Marcus, Commodus his son, Pertinax, Julianus, Severus, Antoninus, Caracalla his son, Macrinus, Heliogabalus, Alexander, and Maximinus. And the first thing to note is that whereas other princes have only to contend against the ambition of the great and the insolence of the people, the Roman emperors had a third difficulty, that of having to support the cruelty and avarice of the soldiers, which was such that it was the cause of the ruin of many, it being hardly possible to satisfy both the soldiers and the people. For the people love tranquility, and therefore like pacific princes. But the soldiers prefer a prince of military spirit who is insolent, cruel, and rapacious. They wish him to exercise these qualities on the people, so that they may get double pay and give vent to their avarice and cruelty. Thus it came about that those emperors who by nature or art hadn't such a reputation as could keep both parties in check were invariably ruined, and the greater number of them who were raised to the empire being new men, knowing the difficulties of these two opposite dispositions, confined themselves to satisfying the soldiers, and thought little of injuring the people. This choice was necessary, princes not being able to avoid being hated by someone. They must first try not to be hated by the mass of the people. If they can't accomplish this, they must use every means to escape the hatred of the most powerful parties. And therefore these emperors, who being new men, had need of extraordinary favors, adhered to the soldiers rather than to the people. Whether this, however, was of use to them or not, depended on whether the prince knew how to maintain his reputation with them. From these causes it resulted that Marcus, Pertinax, and Alexander, being all of modest life, lovers of justice, enemies of cruelty, humane and benign, all came to a sad end, except Marcus. Marcus alone lived and died in honor, because he succeeded to the empire by hereditary right and didn't owe it either to the soldiers or to the people. Besides which, possessing many virtues which made him revered, he kept both parties in their place as long as he lived, and was never either hated or despised. But Pertinax was created emperor against the will of the soldiers, who, being accustomed to live licentiously under Commodus, couldn't put up with the honest life to which Pertinax wished to limit them, so that having made himself hated, and to this contempt being added because he was old, he was ruined at the very beginning of his administration. Whence it may be seen that hatred is gained as much by good works as by evil. And therefore, as I said before, a prince who wishes to maintain the state is often forced to do evil. For when that party, whether populace, soldiery, or nobles, whichever it be that you consider necessary to you for keeping your position, is corrupt, you must follow its humor and satisfy it, and in that case good works will be inimical to you. But let's come to Alexander, who was of such goodness that, among other things for which he's praised, it's said that in the 14 years that he reigned, no one was put to death by him without a fair trial. Nevertheless, being considered effeminate, and a man who allowed himself to be ruled by his mother, and having thus fallen into contempt, the army conspired against him and killed him. Considering, on the other hand, the qualities of Commodus, Severus, Antoninus, Caracalla, and Maximinus, you'll find them extremely cruel and rapacious. To satisfy the soldiers, there was no injury which they wouldn't inflict on the people, and all, except Severus, ended badly. Severus, however, had such abilities that by maintaining the soldiers friendly to him, he was able to reign happily, although he oppressed the people, for his virtues made him so admirable in the sight both of the soldiers and the people, that the latter were in some degree astonished and stupefied, while the former were respectful and contented. As the deeds of this ruler were great and notable for a new prince, I'll briefly show how well he could use the qualities of the fox and the lion, whose natures, as I said before, it's necessary for a prince to imitate. Knowing the sloth of the Emperor Julianus, Severus, who was leader of the troops in Slavonia, persuaded the troops that it would be well to go to Rome to avenge the death of Pertinax, who had been slain by the Praetorian Guard, and under this pretext, without revealing his aspirations to the throne, marched with his army to Rome and was in Italy before his departure was known. On his arrival in Rome, the Senate elected him emperor through fear, and killed Julianus. There remained after this beginning 2 difficulties to be faced by Severus before he could obtain the whole control of the empire. One in Asia, where Nigrinus, head of the Asiatic armies, had declared himself emperor, the other in the west from Albinus, who also aspired to the empire. And as he judged it dangerous to show himself hostile to both, he decided to attack Nigrinus and deceive Albinus, to whom he wrote that having been elected emperor by the Senate, he wished to share that dignity with him. He sent him the title of Caesar, and by deliberation of the Senate, he was declared his colleague, all of which was accepted as true by Albinus. But when Severus had defeated and killed Nigrinus, and pacified things in the east, he returned to Rome, and charged Albinus in the Senate with having, unmindful of the benefits received from him, traitorously sought to assassinate him, and stated that he was therefore obliged to go and punish his ingratitude. He then went to France to meet him, and there deprived him of both his position and his life. Whoever examines in detail the actions of Severus will find him to have been a very ferocious lion and an extremely astute fox, and will find him to have been feared and respected by all, and not hated by the army, and will not be surprised that he, a new man, should have been able to hold so much power, since his great reputation defended him always from the hatred that his rapacity might have produced in the people. But Antoninus, his son, was also a man of great ability, and possessed qualities that rendered him admirable in the sight of the people, and also made him popular with the soldiers, for he was a military man, capable of enduring the most extreme hardships, disdainful of delicate food and every other luxury, which made him loved by all the armies. However, his ferocity and cruelty were so great and unheard of, through his having, after executing many private individuals, caused a large part of the population of Rome and all that of Alexandria to be killed, that he became hated by all the world, and began to be feared by those about him, to such an extent that he was finally killed by a centurion in the midst of his army. Whence it's to be noted that this kind of death, which proceeds from the deliberate action of a determined man, can't be avoided by princes, since anyone who doesn't fear death himself can inflict it. But a prince need not fear much on this account, as such men are extremely rare. He must only guard against committing any grave injury to anyone he makes use of, or has about him for his service, like Antoninus had done, having caused the death with contumely of the brother of that centurion, and also threatened him every day, although he still retained him in his bodyguard, which was a foolish and dangerous thing to do, as the fact proved. But let's come to Commodus, who might easily have kept the empire, having succeeded to it by heredity, being the son of Marcus, and it would have sufficed for him to follow in the steps of his father to have satisfied both the people and the soldiers. But being of a cruel and bestial disposition, in order to be able to exercise his rapacity on the people, he sought to favor the soldiers and render them licentious. On the other hand, by not maintaining his dignity, by often descending into the theater to fight with gladiators, and committing other contemptible actions, little worthy of the imperial dignity, he became despicable in the eyes of the soldiers, and being hated on the one hand and despised on the other, he was conspired against and killed. There remains to be described the character of Maximinus. He was an extremely warlike man, and as the armies were annoyed with the effeminacy of Alexander, which we've already spoken of, he was elected emperor after the death of the latter. He didn't enjoy it for long, as two things made him hated and despised. The one, his base origin, as he had been a shepherd in Thrace, which was generally known and caused great disdain on all sides. The other, because he had at the commencement of his rule deferred going to Rome to take possession of the imperial seat, and had obtained a reputation for great cruelty, having through his prefects in Rome and other parts of the empire committed many acts of cruelty. The whole world, being thus moved by indignation for the baseness of his blood, and also by the hatred caused by fear of his ferocity, he was conspired against first by Africa, and afterward by the Senate and all the people of Rome and Italy. His own army also joined them. For, besieging Aquileia and finding it difficult to take, they became enraged at his cruelty, and seeing that he had so many enemies, they feared him less and put him to death. I won't speak of Heliogabalus, of Macrinus or Julianus, who being entirely contemptible were immediately suppressed. But I will come to the conclusion of this discourse by saying that the princes of our time had less difficulty than these in being obliged to satisfy in an extraordinary degree their soldiers in their states. For although they must have a certain consideration for them, yet any difficulty is soon settled. For none of these princes have armies that are inextricably bound up with the administration of the government and the rule of their provinces, as were the armies of the Roman Empire. If it was then necessary to satisfy the soldiers rather than the people, it was because the soldiers could do more than the people. Now, it is more necessary for all princes, except the Turk and the Sultan, to satisfy the people than the soldiers, for the people can do more than the soldiers. I accept the Turk because he always keeps about him 12,000 infantry and 15,000 cavalry, on which depend the security and strength of his kingdom. And it's necessary for him to postpone every other consideration to keep them friendly. It's the same with the kingdom of the Sultan, which being entirely in the hands of the soldiers, he's bound to keep their friendship regardless of the people. And it's to be noted that this state of the Sultan is different from that of all other princes, being similar to the Christian pontificate, which can't be called either a hereditary kingdom or a new one, for the sons of the dead prince are not his heirs, but he who is elected to that position by those who have authority. And as this order is ancient, it can't be called a new kingdom, there being none of these difficulties which exist in new ones. As although the prince is new, the rules of that state are old, and arranged to receive him as if he were their hereditary lord. But returning to our matter, I say that whoever studies the preceding argument will see that either hatred or contempt were the causes of the ruin of the emperors named, and will also observe how it came about that, some of them acting in one way and some in another, in both ways there were some who had a fortunate and others an unfortunate ending. As Pertinax and Alexander were both new rulers, it was useless and injurious for them to try and imitate Marcus, who was a hereditary prince. And similarly, with Caracalla, Commodus, and Maximinus, it was pernicious for them to imitate Severus, as they hadn't sufficient ability to follow in his footsteps. Thus, a new prince can't imitate the actions of Marcus in his dominions, nor is it necessary for him to imitate those of Severus. But he must take from Severus those things that are necessary to found his state, and from Marcus those that are useful and glorious for conserving a state that is already established and secure. Chapter 20. Whether fortresses and other things which princes often contrive are useful or injurious. Some princes, in order to hold their possessions securely, have disarmed their citizens. Some others have kept their subject lands divided into parts. Others have fomented enmities against themselves. Others have endeavored to win over those whom they suspected at the commencement of their rule. Some have constructed fortresses, others have cast them down and destroyed them. And although one can't pronounce a definite judgment as to these things without going into the particulars of the state to which such a deliberation is to be applied, still, I'll speak in such a general way as the matter will permit. A new prince has never been known to disarm his subjects. On the contrary, when he has found them disarmed, he has always armed them. For by arming them, these arms become your own. Those that you suspected become faithful, and those that were faithful remain so, and from being merely subjects become your partisans. And since all the subjects can't be armed, when you give the privilege of arms to some, you can deal more safely with the others. And this different treatment that they recognize renders your men more obliged to you. The others will excuse you, judging that those have necessarily greater merit who have greater danger and heavier duties. But when you disarm them, you commence to offend them, and show that you distrust them either through cowardice or lack of confidence. And both of these opinions generate hatred against you. And as you can't remain unarmed, you're obliged to resort to a mercenary militia, of which we've already stated the value. And even if it were good, it can't be sufficient in number to defend you against powerful enemies and suspected subjects. Therefore, as I've said, a new prince in a new dominion always has his subjects armed. History is full of such examples. But when a prince acquires a new state as an addition to his old one, then it's necessary to disarm that state, except those who in acquiring it have sided with you. And even these one must, when time and opportunity serve, render weak and effeminate, and arrange things so that all the arms of the new state are in the hands of your soldiers who live near you in your old state. Our forefathers, and those who were esteemed wise, used to say that it was necessary to hold Pistoia by means of factions, and Pisa with fortresses. And for this purpose they fomented differences in some of their subject towns in order to possess them more easily. In those days, when there was a balance of power in Italy, this was doubtless well done, but doesn't seem to me to be a good precept for the present time. For I don't believe that the divisions thus created ever do any good. On the contrary, it's certain that when the enemy approaches, the cities thus divided will be at once lost, for the weaker faction will always side with the enemy, and the other won't be able to stand. The Venetians, actuated, I believe, by the aforesaid motives, fomented the Guelph and Ghibelline factions in the cities subject to them. And although they never allowed them to come to bloodshed, they yet encouraged these differences among them so that the citizens, being occupied in their own quarrels, might not act against them. This, however, didn't avail them anything, as was seen when, after the defeat of Vaila, a part of those subjects immediately took courage and seized the whole state. Such methods, beside, argue weakness in a prince, for in a strong government such dissensions will never be permitted. They are profitable only in time of peace, as by such means it's easy to manage one's subjects, but when it comes to war, the fallacy of such a policy is at once shown. Without doubt, princes become great when they overcome difficulties and opposition. And therefore, fortune, especially when it wants to render a new prince great, who has greater need of gaining a great reputation than a hereditary prince, raises up enemies and compels him to undertake wars against them, so that he may have cause to overcome them, and thus climb up higher by means of that ladder which his enemies have brought him. There are many who think, therefore, that a wise prince ought, when he has the chance, to foment astutely some enmity, so that by suppressing it, he will augment his greatness. Princes, and especially new ones, have found more faith and more usefulness in those men whom at the beginning of their power they regarded with suspicion, than in those they at first confided in. Pandolfo Petrucci, Prince of Siena, governed his state more by those whom he suspected than by others. But of this we can't speak at large, as it strays from the subject. I'll merely say that these men, who at the beginning of a new government were enemies, if they are of a kind to need support to maintain their position, can be very easily gained by the prince, and they are the more compelled to serve him faithfully, as they know they must by their deeds cancel the bad opinion previously held of them. And thus the prince will always derive greater help from them than from those who, serving him with greater security, neglect his interests. And as the matter requires it, I won't omit to remind a prince who has newly taken a state with the secret help of its inhabitants, that he must consider well the motives that have induced those who have favored him to do so. And if it is not natural affection for him, but only because they were not contented with the state as it was, he will have great trouble and difficulty in maintaining their friendship, because it will be impossible for him to content them. And on well examining the cause of this in the examples drawn from ancient and modern times, it will be seen that it's much easier to gain the friendship of those men who were contented with the previous condition, and were therefore at first enemies, than that of those who, not being contented, became his friends and helped him to occupy it. It's been the custom of princes, in order to be able to hold their state securely, to erect fortresses, as a bridle and bit to those who have designs against them, and in order to have a secure refuge against a sudden assault. I approve this method, because it was anciently used. Nevertheless, Messer Niccolo Vitelli has been seen in our own time to destroy 2 fortresses in Città di Castello, in order to keep that state. Guidobaldo, Duke of Urbino, on returning to his dominions from which he had been driven by Cesare Borgia, razed to their foundations all the fortresses of that province, and considered that without them it would be more difficult for him to lose the state again. The Bentivogli, in returning to Bologna, took similar measures. Therefore, fortresses may or may not be useful according to the times. If they do good in one way, they do harm in another. The question may be discussed thus. A prince who fears his own people more than foreigners ought to build fortresses, but he who has greater fear of foreigners than of his own people ought to do without them. The castle of Milan, built by Francesco Sforza, has given and will give more trouble to the house of Sforza than any other disorder in that state. Therefore, the best fortress is to be found in the love of the people. For although you may have fortresses, they will not save you if you are hated by the people. When once the people have taken arms against you, there will never be lacking foreigners to assist them. In our times, we don't see that they have profited any ruler, except the Countess of Forlì, on the death of her consort, Count Girolamo. For she was thus enabled to escape the popular rising and await help from Milan and recover the state, the circumstances being then such that no foreigner could assist the people. But afterwards they were of little use to her when Cesare Borgia attacked her, and the people, being hostile to her, allied themselves with the foreigner. So that then and before, it would have been safer for her not to have been hated by the people than to have had the fortresses. Having considered these things, I would therefore praise the one who erects fortresses and the one who doesn't, and would blame anyone who, trusting in them, recks little of being hated by his people. Chapter 21. How a Prince Must Act in Order to Gain Reputation. Nothing causes a prince to be so much esteemed as great enterprises and giving proof of prowess. We have in our own day Ferdinand, King of Aragon, the present King of Spain. He may almost be termed a new prince because from a weak king he has become, for fame and glory, the first king in Christendom. And if you regard his actions, you will find them all very great, and some of them extraordinary. At the beginning of his reign he assailed Granada, and that enterprise was the foundation of his state. At first he did it at his leisure, and without fear of being interfered with. He kept the minds of the barons of Castile occupied in this enterprise, so that thinking only of that war, they didn't think of making innovations. And he thus acquired reputation and power over them without their being aware of it. He was able, with the money of the church and the people, to maintain his armies, and by that long war to lay the foundations of his military power, which afterwards has made him famous. Besides this, to be able to undertake great enterprises, and always under the pretext of religion, he had recourse to a pious cruelty, driving out the Moors from his kingdom and despoiling them. No more miserable or unusual example can be found. He also attacked Africa under the same pretext, undertook his Italian enterprise, and has lately attacked France, so that he has continually contrived great things, which have kept his subjects' minds uncertain and astonished, and occupied in watching their results. And these actions have arisen one out of the other, so that they have left no time for men to settle down and act against him. It's also very profitable for a prince to give some outstanding example of his greatness in the internal administration, like those related of Messer Bernabo of Milan. When it happens that someone does something extraordinary, either good or evil, in civil life, he must find such means of rewarding or punishing him which will be much talked about. And above all, a prince must endeavor in every action to obtain fame for being great and excellent. A prince is further esteemed when he's a true friend or a true enemy, when, that is, he declares himself without reserve in favor of someone or against another. This policy is always more useful than remaining neutral. For if two neighboring powers come to blows, they are either such that if one wins, you will have to fear the victor, or else not. In either of these two cases, it will be better for you to declare yourself openly and make war, because in the first case, if you don't declare yourself, you'll fall a prey to the victor, to the pleasure and satisfaction of the one who's been defeated, and you will have no reason nor anything to defend you and nobody to receive you. For whoever wins won't desire friends whom he suspects and who don't help him when he's in trouble, and whoever loses won't receive you as you didn't take up arms to venture yourself in his cause. Antiochus went to Greece, being sent by the Aetolians to expel the Romans. He sent orators to the Achaeans, who were friends of the Romans, to encourage them to remain neutral. On the other hand, the Romans persuaded them to take up arms on their side. The matter was brought before the council of the Achaeans for deliberation, where the ambassador of Antiochus sought to persuade them to remain neutral, to which the Roman ambassador replied, "As to what is said, that it is best and most useful for your state not to meddle in our war, nothing is further from the truth. For if you don't meddle in it, you will become without any favor or any reputation the prize of the victor. And it will always happen that the one who isn't your friend will want you to remain neutral, and the one who is your friend will require you to declare yourself by taking arms. Irresolute princes, to avoid present dangers, usually follow the way of neutrality and are mostly ruined by it. But when the prince declares himself frankly in favor of one side, if the one to whom you adhere conquers, even though he is powerful and you remain at his discretion, he's under an obligation to you, and friendship has been established. And men are never so dishonest as to oppose you with such a patent ingratitude. Moreover, Victories are never so prosperous that the victor doesn't need to have some scruples, especially as to justice. But if your ally loses, you are sheltered by him, and so long as he can, he'll assist you. You become the companion of a fortune which may rise again. In the second case, when those who fight are such that you have nothing to fear from the victor, it is still more prudent on your part to adhere to one. For you go to the ruin of one with the help of him who ought to save him if he were wise. And if he conquers, he rests at your discretion, and it's impossible that he shouldn't conquer with your help. And here it should be noted that a prince ought never to make common cause with one more powerful than himself to injure another, unless necessity forces him to it, as before said. For if he wins, you rest in his power, and princes must avoid as much as possible being under the will and pleasure of others. The Venetians united with France against the Duke of Milan, although they could have avoided that alliance, and from it resulted their own ruin. But when one cannot avoid it, as happened in the case of the Florentines when the Pope and Spain went with their armies to attack Lombardy, then the prince ought to join for the above reasons. Let no state believe that it can always follow a safe policy. Rather, let it think that all are doubtful. This is found in the nature of things, that one never tries to avoid one difficulty without running into another. But prudence consists in being able to know the nature of the difficulties and taking the least harmful as good. A prince must also show himself a lover of merit, give preferment to the able, and honor those who excel in every art. Moreover, he must encourage his citizens to follow their callings quietly, whether in commerce or agriculture or any other trade that men follow, so that this one shall not refrain from improving his possessions through fear that they may be taken from him, and that one from starting a trade for fear of taxes. But he should offer rewards to whoever does these things, and to whoever seeks in any way to improve his city or state. Besides this, he ought at convenient seasons of the year to keep the people occupied with festivals and shows, and as every city is divided either into guilds or into classes, he ought to pay attention to all these groups, mingle with them from time to time, and give them an example of his humanity and munificence, always upholding, however, the majesty of his dignity, which must never be allowed to fail in anything whatever. Chapter 22. Of the Secretaries of Princes. The choice of a prince's ministers is a matter of no little importance. They are either good or not, according to the prudence of the prince. The first impression that one gets of a ruler and of his brains is from seeing the men that he has about him. When they're competent and faithful, one can always consider him wise, as he's been able to recognize their ability and keep them faithful. But when they're the reverse, one can always form an unfavorable opinion of him, because the first mistake that he makes is in making this choice. There was nobody who knew Messer Antonio da Venafro as the minister of Pandolfo Petrucci, Prince of Siena, who didn't consider Pandolfo to be a very prudent man, having him for his minister. There are three different kinds of brains. The one understands things unassisted, the other understands things when shown by others, and the third understands neither alone nor with the explanations of others. The first kind is most excellent, the second also excellent, but the third useless. It's therefore evident that if Pandolfo was not of the first kind, he was at any rate of the second. For every time the prince has the judgment to know the good and evil that anyone does or says, even if he has no originality of intellect, yet he can recognize the bad and good works of his minister and correct the one and encourage the other, and the minister cannot hope to deceive him, and therefore remains good. For a prince to be able to know a minister, there is this method which never fails. When you see the minister, think more of himself than you, and in all his actions seek his own profit. Such a man will never be a good minister, and you can never rely on him. For whoever has in hand the state of another must never think of himself but of the prince, and not mind anything but what relates to him. And on the other hand, the prince, in order to retain his fidelity, ought to think of his minister, honoring and enriching him, doing him kindnesses, and conferring on him honors and giving him responsible tasks, so that the great honors and riches bestowed on him cause him not to desire other honors and riches, and the offices he holds make him fearful of changes. When princes and their ministers stand in this relation to each other, they can rely the one upon the other. When it's otherwise, the result is always injurious either for one or the other of them. Chapter 23. How Flatterers Must be Shunned. I must not omit an important subject, and mention of a mistake which princes can with difficulty avoid if they are not very prudent, or if they do not make a good choice. And this is with regard to flatterers, of which courts are full, because men take pleasure in their own things, and deceive themselves about them, that they can with difficulty guard against this plague. And by wishing to guard against it, they run the risk of becoming contemptible. Because there's no other way of guarding oneself against flattery than by letting men understand that they won't offend you by speaking the truth. But when everyone can tell you the truth, you lose their respect. A prudent prince must therefore take a third course, by choosing for his counsel wise men, and giving these alone full liberty to speak the truth to him, but only of those things that he asks, and of nothing else. But he must ask them about everything and hear their opinion, and afterwards deliberate by himself in his own way, and in these counsels and with each of these men comport himself so that everyone may see that the more freely he speaks, the more he will be acceptable. Beyond these he should listen to no one, go about the matter deliberately, and be determined in his decisions. Whoever acts otherwise either acts precipitately through flattery, or else changes often through the variety of opinions, from which it follows that he will be little esteemed. I will give a modern instance of this. Pre Luca, a follower of Maximilian, the present emperor, speaking of his majesty, said that he never took counsel with anybody, and yet that he never did anything as he wished. This arose from his following the contrary method to the aforesaid. As the emperor is a secret man, he doesn't communicate his designs to anyone or take any advice. But as on putting them into effect they begin to be known and discovered, they begin to be opposed by those he has about him, and he is easily diverted from his purpose. Hence it comes to pass that what he does one day he undoes the next. No one ever understands what he wishes or intends to do, and no reliance is to be placed on his deliberations. A prince, therefore, ought always to take counsel, but only when he wishes, not when others wish. On the contrary, he ought to discourage absolutely attempts to advise him unless he asks it. But he ought to be a great asker, and a patient hearer of the truth about those things of which he has inquired. Indeed, if he finds that anyone has scruples in telling him the truth, he should be angry. And since some think that a prince who gains his reputation of being prudent is so considered not by his nature, but by the good counselors he has about him, they are undoubtedly deceived. It's an infallible rule that a prince who isn't wise himself can't be well advised, unless by chance he leaves himself entirely in the hands of one man who rules him in everything, but happens to be a very prudent man. In this case, he may doubtless be well governed, but it wouldn't last long, for that governor would in a short time deprive him of the state. But by taking counsel with many, a prince who isn't wise will never have united counsels, and won't be able to bring them to unanimity for himself. The counselors will all think of their own interests, and he'll be unable either to correct or to understand them. And it cannot be otherwise. For men will always be false to you unless they are compelled by necessity to be true. Therefore it must be concluded that wise counsels, from whoever they come, must necessarily be due to the prudence of the prince, and not the prudence of the prince to the good counsels received. Chapter 25. How much fortune can do in human affairs, and how it may be opposed. It's not unknown to me how many have been and are of opinion that worldly events are so governed by fortune and by God that men can't by their prudence change them, and that, on the contrary, there's no remedy whatever. And for this, they may judge it to be useless to toil much about them, but let things be ruled by chance. This opinion has been more held in our day from the great changes that we have seen, and are daily seen, beyond every human conjecture. When I think about them, at times I'm partly inclined to share this opinion. Nevertheless, that our free will may not be altogether extinguished, I think it may be true that fortune is the ruler of half our actions, but that she allows the other half, or thereabouts, to be governed by us. I would compare her to an impetuous river that, when turbulent, inundates the plains, casts down trees and buildings, removes earth from this side and places it on the other. Everyone flees before it, and everything yields to its fury, without being able to oppose it. And yet, though it is of such a kind, still, when it is quiet, men can make provisions against it by dikes and banks, so that when it rises, it will either go into a canal, or its rush will not be so wild and dangerous. So it is with fortune, which shows her power where no measures have been taken to resist her, and directs her fury where she knows that no dikes or barriers have been made to hold her. And if you regard Italy, which has been the seat of these changes, and which has given the impulse to them, you will see her to be a country without dikes or banks of any kind. If she had been protected by proper measures, like Germany, Spain, and France, this inundation wouldn't have caused the great changes that it has, or wouldn't have happened at all. This must suffice as regards opposition to fortune in general. But limiting myself more to particular cases, I would point out how one sees a certain prince today fortunate and tomorrow ruined, without seeing that he has changed in character or otherwise. I believe this arises in the first place from the causes that we have already discussed at length. That is to say, because the prince who bases himself entirely on fortune is ruined when fortune changes. I also believe that he is happy whose mode of procedure accords with the needs of the times, and similarly he is unfortunate whose mode of procedure is opposed to the times. For one sees that men in those things which lead them to the aim that each one has in view, namely, glory and riches, proceed in various ways. One with circumspection, another with impetuosity, one by violence, another by cunning, one with patience, another with the reverse. And each by these diverse ways may arrive at his aim. One sees also two cautious men, one of whom succeeds in his designs and the other not. And in the same way two men succeed equally by different methods, one being cautious, the other impetuous, which arises only from the nature of the times, which does or doesn't conform to their method of procedure. From this it results, as I've said, that two men, acting differently, attain the same effect, and of two others acting in the same way, one attains his goal and not the other. On this depend also the changes in prosperity. For if it happens that time and circumstances are favorable to one who acts with caution and prudence, he will be successful. But if time and circumstance change, he will be ruined, because he doesn't change his mode of procedure. No man is found so prudent as to be able to adapt himself to this, either because he can't deviate from that to which his nature disposes him, or else because, having always prospered by walking in one path, he can't persuade himself that it is well to leave it. And therefore the cautious man, when it's time to act suddenly, doesn't know how to do so, and is consequently ruined. For if one could change one's nature with time and circumstances, fortune would never change. Pope Julius II acted impetuously in everything he did, and found the times and conditions so in conformity with that mode of procedure that he always obtained a good result. Consider the first war that he made against Bologna, when Messer Giovanni Bentivogli was still living. The Venetians were not pleased with it, neither was the King of Spain. France was conferring with him over the enterprise, notwithstanding which, owing to his fierce and impetuous disposition, he engaged personally in the expedition. This move caused both Spain and the Venetians to halt and hesitate. The latter through fear, the former through the desire to recover the entire kingdom of Naples. On the other hand, he engaged with him the King of France, because, seeing him make this move and desiring his friendship in order to put down the Venetians, that king judged that he couldn't refuse him his troops without manifest injury. Thus Julius, by his impetuous move, achieved what no other pontiff, with the utmost human prudence, would have succeeded in doing. Because if he had waited until all arrangements had been made and everything settled before leaving Rome, as any other pontiff would have done, it would never have succeeded. For the King of France would have found 1,000 excuses, and the others would have inspired him with 1,000 fears. I'll omit his other actions, which were all of this kind, and which all succeeded well. And the shortness of his life didn't suffer him to experience the contrary. For had times followed in which it was necessary to act with caution, his ruin would have resulted, for he would never have deviated from these methods to which his nature disposed him. I conclude, then, that fortune varying, and men remaining fixed in their ways, they are successful so long as these ways conform to circumstances, but when they're opposed, then they are unsuccessful. I certainly think that it's better to be impetuous than cautious, for fortune is a woman, and it is necessary, if you wish to master her, to conquer her by force. And it can be seen that she lets herself be overcome by the bold, rather than by those who proceed coldly. And therefore, like a woman, she is always a friend to the young, because they are less cautious, fiercer, and master her with greater audacity. Chapter 26. Exhortation to liberate Italy from the barbarians. Having now considered all the things we've spoken of, and thought within myself whether at present the time was not propitious in Italy for a new prince, and if there wasn't a state of things which offered an opportunity to a prudent and capable man to introduce a new system that would do honor to himself and good to the mass of the people, it seems to me that so many things concur to favor a new ruler that I don't know of any time more fitting for such an enterprise. And if, as I said, it was necessary, in order that the power of Moses should be displayed, that the people of Israel should be slaves in Egypt, and to give scope for the greatness and courage of Cyrus, that the Persians should be oppressed by the Medes, and to illustrate the preeminence of Theseus, that the Athenians should be dispersed, so at the present time, in order that the might of an Italian genius might be recognized, it was necessary that Italy should be reduced to her present condition, and that she should be more enslaved than the Hebrews, more oppressed than the Persians, and more scattered than the Athenians, without a head, without order, beaten, despoiled, lacerated, and overrun, and that she should have suffered ruin of every kind. And although before now a gleam of hope has appeared, which gave hope that some individual might be appointed by God for her redemption, yet at the highest summit of his career he was thrown aside by fortune, so that now, almost lifeless, she awaits one who may heal her wounds and put a stop to the pillaging of Lombardy, to the rapacity and extortion in the kingdom of Naples and in Tuscany, and cure her of those sores which have long been festering. Behold how she prays God to send someone to redeem her from this barbarous cruelty and insolence. Behold her ready and willing to follow any standard, if only there be someone to raise it. There's nothing now she can hope for but that your illustrious house may place itself at the head of this redemption, being by its power and fortune so exalted, and being favored by God and the Church, of which it is now the ruler. Nor will this be very difficult, if you call to mind the action and lives of the men I have named. And although these men were rare and marvelous, they were none the less men, and each of them had less opportunity than the present. for their enterprise was not juster than this, nor easier, nor was God more their friend than he is yours. Here is a just cause. Iustum enim est bellum quibus necessarium, et pia arma ubi nulla nisi in armis spes est. Here is the greatest willingness. Nor can there be great difficulty where there is great willingness, provided that the measures are adopted of those whom I have set before you as examples. Besides this, unexampled wonders have been seen here performed by God. The sea has been opened. A cloud has shown you the road. The rock has given forth water. Manna has rained. And everything has contributed to your greatness. The remainder must be done by you. God will not do everything, in order not to deprive us of free will and the portion of the glory that falls to our lot. It's no marvel that none of the before-mentioned Italians have done that which it is to be hoped your illustrious house may do. And if in so many revolutions in Italy and so many warlike operations it always seems as if military capacity were extinct, this is because the ancient methods were not good, and no one has arisen who knew how to discover new ones. Nothing does so much honor to a newly risen man than the new laws and measures which he introduces. These things, when they are well-based and have greatness in them, render him revered and admired. And there is not lacking scope in Italy for the introduction of every kind of new organization. Here there is a great virtue in the members, if it were not wanting in the heads. Look how in duels and in contests of a few the Italians are superior in strength, dexterity, and intelligence. But when it comes to armies they make a poor show, which proceeds entirely from the weakness of the leaders. For those that know aren't obeyed, and everyone thinks that he knows, there being hitherto nobody who has raised himself so high both in valor and fortune as to make the others yield. Hence it comes about that for so long a time in all the wars waged during the last 20 years, whenever there has been an entirely Italian army, it has always been a failure, as witness Taro, then Alexandria, Capua, Genoa, Vaila, Bologna, and Mestre. If your illustrious house, therefore, wishes to follow those great men who redeemed their countries, it is before all things necessary as the true foundation of every undertaking to provide yourself with your own forces, for you can't have more faithful or truer and better soldiers. And although each one of them may be good, they will united become even better when they see themselves commanded by their prince, and honored and favored by him. It's therefore necessary to prepare such forces in order to be able with Italian prowess to defend the country from foreigners. And although both the Swiss and Spanish infantry are deemed terrible, nonetheless they each have their defects, so that a third method of array might not only oppose them, but be confident of overcoming them. For the Spaniards can't sustain the attack of cavalry, and the Swiss have to fear infantry which meets them with resolution equal to their own. From which it has resulted, as will be seen by experience, that the Spaniards can't sustain the attack of French cavalry, and the Swiss are overthrown by Spanish infantry. And although a complete example of the latter has not been seen, yet an instance was furnished in the Battle of Ravenna, where the Spanish infantry attacked the German battalions, which are organized in the same way as the Swiss. The Spaniards, through their bodily agility and aided by their bucklers, had entered between and under their pikes, and were in a position to attack them safely without the Germans being able to defend themselves. And if the cavalry hadn't charged them, they would have utterly destroyed them. Knowing, therefore, the defects of both these kinds of infantry, a third kind can be created, which can resist cavalry and need not fear infantry. And this will be done by the choice of arms and a new organization. And these are the things which, when newly introduced, give reputation and grandeur to a new prince. This opportunity must not, therefore, be allowed to pass, so that Italy may at length find her liberator. I cannot express the love with which he would be received in all those provinces which have suffered under these foreign invasions. With what thirst for vengeance, with what steadfast faith, with what love, with what grateful tears. What doors would be closed against him? What people would refuse him obedience? What envy could oppose him? What Italian would withhold allegiance? This barbarous domination stinks in the nostrils of everyone. May your illustrious house therefore assume this task with that courage and those hopes which are inspired by a just cause. One sees, on the other hand, that when princes think more of luxury than of arms, they lose their state. The chief cause of the loss of states is the contempt of this art, and the way to acquire them is to be well versed in the same. Francesco Sforza, through being well armed, became from private status Duke of Milan. His sons, through wishing to avoid the fatigue and hardships of war, from dukes became private persons. For among other evils caused by being disarmed, it renders you contemptible, which is one of those disgraceful things which a prince must guard against, as will be explained later. Because there's no comparison whatever between an armed and a disarmed man. It's not reasonable to suppose that one who is armed will obey willingly one who is unarmed, or that any unarmed man will remain safe among armed servants. For one being disdainful and the other suspicious, it's not possible for them to act well together. And therefore a prince who is ignorant of military matters, besides the other misfortunes already mentioned, can't be esteemed by his soldiers nor have confidence in them. He ought, therefore, never to let his thoughts stray from the exercise of war. And in peace he ought to practice it more than in war, which he can do in two ways, by action and by study. As to action, he must, besides keeping his men well disciplined and exercised, engage continually in hunting, and thus accustom his body to hardships, and meanwhile learn the nature of the land, how steep the mountains are, how the valleys debouch, where the plains lie, and understand the nature of rivers and swamps. To all this he should devote great attention. This knowledge is useful in two ways. In the first place, one learns to know one's country, and can the better see how to defend it. Then by means of the knowledge and experience gained in one locale, ruin is complete, for they are all united, and owe obedience to others. Whereas with mercenaries, when they have conquered, it requires more time and a good opportunity for them to injure you, as they don't form a single body, and have been engaged and paid by you. Therefore, a third party that you have made leader can't at once acquire enough authority to be able to injure you. In a word, the greatest danger with mercenaries lies in their cowardice and reluctance to fight, but with auxiliaries, the danger lies in their courage. A wise prince, therefore, always avoids these forces and has recourse to his own, and would prefer rather to lose with his own men than conquer with the forces of others, not deeming it a true victory which is gained by foreign arms. I never hesitate to cite the example of Cesare Borgia and his actions. This duke entered Romagna with auxiliary troops, leading forces composed entirely of French soldiers, and with these he took Imola and Forlì. But as they seemed unsafe, he had recourse to mercenaries as a less risky policy, and hired the Orsini and Vitelli. Afterwards, finding these uncertain to handle, unfaithful and dangerous, he suppressed them, and relied upon his own men. And the difference between these forces can be easily seen if one considers the difference between the reputation of the Duke when he had only the French, when he had the Orsini and Vitelli, and when he had to rely on himself and his own soldiers. His reputation will be found to have constantly increased, and he was never so highly esteemed as when everyone saw that he was the sole master of his forces. I don't wish to depart from recent Italian instances, but I can't omit Hiero of Syracuse, whom I've already mentioned. This man, being, as I said, made head of the army by the Syracusans, immediately recognized the uselessness of that militia which was organized like our Italian mercenary troops, and as he thought it unsafe either to retain them or to dismiss them, he had them cut in pieces and thenceforward made war with his own arms and not those of others. I would also call to mind a symbolic tale from the Old Testament which well illustrates this point. When David offered to Saul to go and fight against the Philistine champion Goliath, Saul, to encourage him, armed him with his own arms, which, when David had tried on, he refused, saying that with them he couldn't fight so well. He preferred, therefore, to face the enemy with his own sling and knife. In short, the arms of others either fail, overburden, or else impede you. Charles VII, father of King Louis XI, having through good fortune and bravery liberated France from the English, recognized this necessity of being armed with his own forces, and established in his kingdom a system of men-at-arms and infantry. Afterwards, King Louis, his son, abolished the infantry and began to hire Swiss, which mistake being followed by others is, as may now be seen, a cause of danger to that kingdom. For by giving such reputation to the Swiss, France has disheartened all her own troops, the infantry having been abolished and the men-at-arms being obliged to foreigners for assistance. For being accustomed to fight with Swiss troops, they think they cannot conquer without them. Whence it comes that the French are insufficiently strong to oppose the Swiss, and without the aid of the Swiss, they won't venture against others. The armies of the French are thus of a mixed kind, partly mercenary and partly her own. Taken together, they are much better than troops entirely composed of mercenaries or auxiliaries, but much inferior to national forces. And let this example be sufficient, for the kingdom of France would be invincible if Charles' military organization had been developed or maintained. But men with their lack of prudence initiate novelties, and finding the first taste good, don't notice the poison within, as I pointed out previously in regard to wasting fevers. The prince, therefore, who fails to recognize troubles in his state as they arise, is not truly wise, and it is given to few to be thus. If we consider the first cause of the collapse of the Roman Empire, we shall find it merely due to the hiring of Goth mercenaries, for from that time we find the Roman strength begins to weaken. All the advantages derived from the empire fell to the Goths. I conclude, then, by saying that no prince is secure without his own troops. On the contrary, he is entirely dependent on fortune, having no trustworthy means of defense in time of trouble. It has always been held and proclaimed by wise men, quod nihil sit tam infirmum, aut instabile quam fama potentii non sua vi nixi. One's own troops are those composed either of subjects or of citizens, or of one's own dependents. All others are mercenaries or auxiliaries. The way to organize one's own troops is easily learned if the methods of the 4 princes mentioned above be studied, and if one considers how Philip, father of Alexander the Great, and many republics and sovereigns have organized theirs. With such examples as these, there's no need to labor the point. Chapter 14. The duties of a prince with regard to the militia. A prince should therefore have no other aim or thought, nor take up any other thing for his study, but war, and its organization and discipline. For that is the only art that is necessary to one who commands, and it is of such virtue that it not only maintains those who are born princes, but often enables men of private fortune to attain to that rank. Chapter 13. Of auxiliary, mixed, and native troops. When one asks a powerful neighbor to come to aid and defend one with his forces, they are termed auxiliaries, and are as useless as mercenaries. This was done in recent times by Julius, who, seeing the wretched failure of his mercenary forces in his Ferrara enterprise, had recourse to auxiliaries, and arranged with Ferrando, king of Spain, that he should help him with his armies. These forces may be good in themselves, but they're always dangerous for those who borrow them. For if they lose, you are defeated, and if they conquer, you remain their prisoner. And although ancient history is full of examples of this, I won't depart from the example of Pope Julius II, which is still fresh. Nothing could be less prudent than the course he adopted. For, wishing to take Ferrara, he put himself entirely into the power of a foreigner. But by good fortune there arose a third cause which prevented him reaping the effects of his bad policy. For when his auxiliaries were beaten at Ravenna, the Swiss rose up and drove back the victors, against all expectation of himself or others, so that he wasn't taken prisoner by the enemy which had fled, nor by his own auxiliaries, having conquered by other arms than theirs. The Florentines, being totally disarmed, hired 10,000 Frenchmen to attack Pisa, by which measure they ran greater risk than at any period of their struggles. The Emperor of Constantinople, to oppose his neighbors, put 10,000 Turks into Greece, who after the war wouldn't go away again, which was the beginning of the servitude of Greece to the infidels. And one therefore who wishes not to conquer would do well to use these forces, which are much more dangerous than mercenaries. As with